if you had to do one thing to make a behavior happen, I would say simplify it.
If you can get somebody to tell a story, there is just so much to learn from that organic way of sharing, and it's definitely not just linear. It uncovers the why in a very different way.
In fact, that actually comes in the way of companies applying behavior sciences, because you see, you may design something, but we know that majority of designs won't work. So you have to have a DNA in the organization that, okay, look, I'll come up with 5 or 6 different things, I'll test and I'll see what works.
Welcome to our podcast, Unmistakably Human. In a world that's obsessed with shiny new things in technology, we want to focus on what really makes it work, on uncovering insights with our guests on what makes it unmistakably human. Today, I'm super excited to have our guest, Pooja Haldia, with us. We've had the chance to work with Pooja at the Center of Social and Behavioral Change. Pooja joins us today to share her views, and we're very excited to learn from her. Just a quick introduction. Pooja is a senior advisor with over 20 years of experience in behavior science and consumer behavior. Her work is in both the private and development sector. And she's known for her work as a senior advisor at the Center of Social and Behavioral Change at Ashoka University. And today we're extremely excited to learn on insights on this discipline and how we can incorporate that in our work and lives. So thank you, Pooja, for making time for this. We're super excited.
Thank you for having me.
I think we have so many questions. I personally have so many questions ever since we have been interacting with you on some very exciting interventions on behavior change, specifically on the project that we collaborated on, waste segregation and energy consumption. But before we dive into learning more about this discipline and your experience of it, would love to hear from you about your journey. What's brought you here?
So I wanted to study psychology in school, but ended up studying sciences and then did mathematics and then B school. So, very well trodden path. But even when I was in B school, I think the course that really caught my attention, that I really enjoyed, was around consumer behavior. And so that stuck with me. After B school, I went into consulting. I spent 10 years with McKinsey. I worked all over the world. And a lot of the projects, again, which stay with me, were all to do with consumer behavior, insights, and so on and so forth. So, we worked with a beauty company on how do we get women to buy more makeup in India. We worked, with a newspaper on how do we increase readership. I wrote a report with some of my colleagues on modern retail and, just when it had come into India, what would get consumers to buy. So anyways, all the topics all the projects which stayed with me were in that area. And so therefore, then I took a sabbatical and I said, look, I'm pretty clear that, this is an area which is of interest to me. So how can I actually go more deep into this? And also around that time, I remember listening to a TED video, which was by Sendal Mullainathan, which is essentially around the last mile, looking at consumer insights for development. So you've seen it. If you haven't, then, I would recommend everyone to watch it. That got me very interested in the development sector and the use of insights, behavior science in the development sector. Anyways, in the middle, I also set up a marketing consulting organization in India. It was called Brain Juicer. It was a global organization. I set up the India office. There we used behavior science, not for development, but more for private sector. How to improve communication, marketing, research using, principles of behavior science. Did around 150 projects there. In the middle of it all, had 3 kids. And then in 2017, this opportunity came to set up the first ever sort of center of its kind, which was how do we use behavior science for impact, especially on strengthening government programs and policies on the ground. So that seemed very interesting. And so I jumped at the opportunity and then had set up the center. And of course, now the center is growing and it's doing a lot of interesting work all across many sectors. So that's the development sector part of it. In addition, I continue to consult with private sector organizations. Again, all is in the area of how do we use consumer insights, user insights, behavioral insights to have impact.
Interesting. In fact, it seems your journey started with shaping consumer behavior in the private sector first.
Yes.
And then that's very
interesting. Then into the development sector, yes. And then now back partly in the private and development zone.
And is there a difference really fundamentally?
Are you asking me in private sector and development sector, or
Yeah.
specifically the application of behavior science?
Yeah, specifically the application of this discipline in both of these sectors.
Right. So it's very interesting because both the sectors actually use behavior science. It's just that they come at it from very different angles. So if you look at the development sector, it has been talking about behavior science under the heading of SBCC, just social and behavior change communication. And the development sector, for a long period of time, behavior change has been within the realm of communication. Private sector, on the other hand, started. Of course, there is the discipline of marketing and below the line marketing, which of course uses a lot of aspects of behavior science. But especially in the last, let's say, decade, with the coming of a lot of digital companies, the entire science of UI UX design uses behavior science. So they come at it from a design perspective. So what is now happening is, so in the development sector, I said, it was very communication led. Now the development sector is moving beyond, saying that behavior change is not just communication. It could be design, it could be policy design, it could be incentives, it could be many different things. I think private sector came very much from, it is design. How do we design? Either it's our stores or it's our UI UX. But now they're going a little bit to the principles used in dev sector, around research and understanding your target consumer. So the UI UX is not just about it being most beautifully designed, and it's not only designed, because now in private sector, one of the other things is happening is that earlier the digital offerings were for a certain segment of society who were global in nature and who had also work on
Access, yeah.
so access is different, digital literacy is different, usage
Correct.
of now obviously we are designing for the next 1 billion. So again, private sector is now adopting some of the principles that dev sector has been using for a while, which is, okay, now this is a new set of consumer. Now we need to understand how they use, where this fits in their lives, and design for that. So again, both development sector and private sector have been using behavioral science, but a little bit more in a very in their own narrow way. And now I think we are in phase two, where I think a little bit all of this is sort of coming together.
Yeah, what you mentioned is also our work, right? Where we're designing digital products, digital experiences, where essentially we're trying to influence a certain behavior change because we have to move the metric up on the needle on either adoption or time spent, or there's a very specific behavioral goals which are tied to the business goals. But over the last 20 plus years, shaping these frameworks, and I imagine policy as well. What has been some of the most rewarding interventions that you've been a part of in your personal experience?
Okay, so that is a tough one. I will not think of any one intervention as being most rewarding. I think if I actually had to answer that question, I would say I think one of the most rewarding things for me and also for the center at Ashoka has been to set up behavioral insight units within the government. We first started with setting it up at Niti Aayog, and then in UP and Bihar, and now we are working with a few other states on setting up a behavioral insight unit, which can regularly work with the government as it's designed, as the government designs its policies, its programs. It can actually incorporate behavior science right from the start and also on an ongoing basis. So I think for me, that bit, structurally putting behavior science, at the center of policy making, I think that would be the most rewarding thing. If you ask me a piece of work that has been most rewarding, I would say, we've been working for many years on the issue of anemia, especially anemia amongst pregnant women. And I think just the scale of the problem, over 50% of women in India are anemic. It has huge implications on, of course, the woman's health, but also baby's health. And it sets up a cycle of, anemia an intergenerational anemia. I mean, just to talk a little bit about it, I think when we started working in this area of anemia, I think the general thought was that the issue is that women in rural areas do not understand how big an issue anemia is. So there is an issue of awareness and education. But when we went to the ground, we realized that actually, awareness in education was really not the issue. Government has been running campaigns for many years on anemia because this is not a new problem. So, in fact, the knowledge about anemia, even awareness around anemia, knowledge about the IFA tablets, all of it, the IFA tablets are the supplements that they basically need to take, especially during, their second and third trimester of pregnancy, to avoid anemia, of course improve anemia at their own for their own self, but also make it helps the delivery and so on and so forth. So the awareness part was actually not what was really broken. I think that when we went and we tried to understand the issue more, I think there were some very simple issues around forgetfulness and inertia. And this is not difficult for you and me to understand. I mean, if you have to take 180 pills every day for a disease which is in some sense a silent disease, because it's not that you're bleeding or something, you're in pain. I mean, it's just you're tired, and you're probably already anyway tired when you're pregnant. So for a silent sort of disease, if you are asked to take 180 days of pills which may have side effects, sometimes significant side effects. So the issue is not around awareness. It's not about education. It's not about, again, going and give the nth lecture to the woman about, anemia and its issues. But it is about how can you help her deal with her side effects? How can you counsel her better on the side effects? And most importantly, even if, all of that is in place, how do you get someone to remember to take a pill every day? So moving the needle from saying, look, we need to move beyond awareness, education, and so on, but we need to run interventions which A, help the women cope with side effects, B, helps them to remember every day a pill needs to be taken more, and create some sort of a motivation for them to take the pill. That is what is the need of the hour. So the things that we, for example, tried, and some of it worked really well, were, for example, designing like a scratch card where every time that they took a pill, they scratched it. And this was a beautiful painting that we had essentially made that they could put on their wall. So every day that they're taking a pill, they can, and every time they scratch, they saw a beautiful face of a baby. And so that's also motivating.
Oh, wow.
That was one. Now that sounds interesting, but as you can understand, when you're working in the development sector, scaling up those things can be difficult. So there was another intervention which also did really well, was just a visual counseling card for the health workers, which essentially made it very visually accessible, both to how to explain for the ASHA worker, but also for the woman to understand that there will be side effects. They will last for a few days. These are the kind of side effects, and if you want to minimize side effects, do 1, 2, 3. And it was visually shown, and it was a double printed card. So, the ASHA is reading it out, the woman can see the visuals. And that's something which is, of course, much more easily scalable, because you just need to give it to the ASHA workers. It's not something that you need to give to every pregnant lady. And again, we found that intervention had a very significant impact on the ground. So also because, earlier the health workers were either not giving, they were not even talking about side effects because they didn't want to scare a woman. And that worked counterintuitively, because if you've never been told about side effects and suddenly you are struggling, then you're more likely to stop taking or not. And secondly, the advice was not very standardized, was very complicated. Don't take it on an empty stomach, don't take it on a full stomach, don't drink tea after it, try to take it with vitamin C. And we try to actually, very simply say, just take it an hour before bed, which we thought was like
takes care of all of this.
Which takes care of many things, but also just creates a very simple hook and say, this is how you should take it. So simplifying that behavior, giving them tips and tricks to cope with the side effects, giving them a memory device so that they can actually remember to take the pill. Those were the things we thought, they ended up working much better than other interventions that we had designed, which are all around communication, awareness. We'd created testimonials, we had created, a whole visual campaign. I mean, all of that had very limited impact. So that is also an area, and you may go with a gut instinct and you may think, okay, the issue must be awareness. They must not know how big an issue that is. But then when you're on the ground, you realize, actually awareness, knowledge, etc. is high. But how do you convert that awareness into motivation? And then how do you convert that motivation into action? That gap, is what needed to be bridged, not the step one.
As you were speaking, I was reminded based on our recent interactions. Sometimes, even as designers, we were excited about some really out of the box creative ideas. While they can work, sometimes the answer is really, really simple. And I
Yes.
think that's what you were also kind of referring to right now.
Yes, and in fact, I always, when I'm in the intervention design phase, you know, my number one thing is that look, you can make something more attractive, you can make it look more beautiful, you can do many things, but if the one thing that you need to start by, if you want to make a behavior happen, is to simplify everything around it. And therefore, even when we are designing interventions, we are always thinking, let's not invent something new. It's not about innovation. It's not about the new cool idea that you're going, because that idea will require a humongous amount of effort to actually put in place. But what you need is optimization. A system is already in place. Can you look at that system, tweak it, optimize it, make that behavior a little bit more simpler, make that behavior a little bit more aligned with the person's goals? And the third thing we see is that, can you make that behavior a little bit more social? Can you bring a little bit of a social component to it? That's the kind of questions that we ask. It's not often, the ideas that have worked on the ground have not often been like these big massive changes that you bring to the system. It's
Yeah.
about small changes. I mean, in fact, even in CSBC, one of the things that we found works so effectively, and again, it's so easy to scale up, is peer-based WhatsApp groups. We have tried that in context of financial inclusion. We have tried it in the context of young women, mothers, complementary feeding, so that they feed nutritious diets to the kid. We work with parents because we want them to get more involved in a child's education. So all these different use cases, we've tried. One of the interventions that we've tried, which works beautifully, is just putting the peers together in a WhatsApp group, which is very doable for large segments of society today.
Yeah.
Because it's not possible for all of India, but for large parts of society, it's possible. You put them in these peer WhatsApp groups. Either these WhatsApp groups already exist, and use those not only to simplify the behavior, not only to link it to their active goals, but also to create a little bit of peer pressure, to create new norms, to create a little bit of competition, to create a little bit of also collaboration and problem solving. In fact, even the work that we have done together, right, in waste segregation, one of the interventions is that we have these RWA groups. We must leverage these RWA groups to create new norms in the society. And I think, creating WhatsApp group is not something very cool or innovative or new. I mean, these WhatsApp groups already exist, but using that platform in a slightly different way, using it for a slightly different purpose, can make all the difference. So, it's not about innovating, it is about optimizing. If you had to do one thing to make a behavior happen, I would say simplify it.
I think it's also interesting that you have to start with what the current ecosystem is, perhaps, and understand what are the touch points and see if there's a possibility to leverage that.
Absolutely. And don't, any behavior change work which increases the load in the system, makes the system more complicated, adds to the workload of someone, in that value chain, is
not going to work.
It's not going to work. So simplifying, making it easier for all the people inside it, simplifying the messages, simplifying the process, simplifying, the way the whole thing, kind of pans out, reducing the load from the system. That is, I would say, the number one thing that we should start with when we start designing behavioral interventions.
Yeah. I'm reminded of this other example for anemia. I think it was in Cambodia where they introduced a cultural intervention of the lucky fish, which was made of iron.
Yes.
How effective that was. It's quite distributed, celebrated case study. So
yes,
it was interesting.
But that's the interesting thing, that when you're designing interventions, the importance of research, that's why cannot be understated, because what may work, we looked at that fish study as well, and we were sort of saying, should we think, of course we can't use a fish itself in India, that's obvious, but you have to understand the context and saying, okay, now could we actually get millions of women to start putting an iron object in their food? that may be tougher. Again, there is a distribution challenge. How do you even get this iron tab, iron thing that needs to be put in the food? So you look at the context, you look and you say that, okay, that may work in that context in Southeast Asia, but it doesn't work in India. What may work in India is XYZ. So that power of research, understanding the context, what can work, what can't work. Obviously, I don't have to say that again. That's quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it difficult to measure the effectiveness?
Yes, it is difficult. So again, it depends on the context. See, if you are trying anything which is digital, monitoring the impact is much easier. For example, we've been doing some work on UPI uptake. So getting women in rural India to start using UPI for payments. Something like that, measuring effectiveness is quite easy. You try something and then you see whether UPI has gone up or not, right? So I think a lot of the work that we end up doing in health and nutrition, for example, even if you take the simple thing of anemia, you can try anything, but it's not that the woman will stop becoming anemic. At the most, you can try and measure the number of pills that she has taken. That also sometimes you have to resort to using self-reported measures, which again, are very problematic because
Right.
there is a social desirability bias. You always want to give the right answer and so on and so forth. So it depends. In some cases, measurement is easier. In some cases, measurement may be tricky, but that is really what in behavior science, trying to figure out even difficult to measure outcomes. What are ways in which you can measure it? Are there some proxy measures that you can put? Any intermediate measures that you can put? Because see, in behavior science, unlike a lot of let's say in marketing, for example, when you do a survey and if you want to measure whether an ad campaign is working or not, you will stop at asking people intent. So after watching this ad, are you more likely to buy, right? But that's stopping at intent. When we do measuring effectiveness in behavior science, we are actually looking at whether the actual behavior has changed or not. So in some sense, we cannot just stop at a survey which asks people, so after this, are you more likely to take a pill? You have to some way or the other devise a method on the ground to be able to actually measure that behavior. And I think we spend a lot of time on the drawing board trying to figure out what that proxy measure or for behavior can be, which makes us comfortable that the behavior is actually happening. And it's not just that the attitudes or the beliefs or even the motivation has changed. So after you have done the diagnosis, you have done the design, you have designed the intervention, then that is the last phase, which is how to design the experiment and then run it. So that's not a trivial. That's not a trivial thing, especially when we go to non-digital.
And I imagine to be able to do that at scale, there's always a pilot first where we're able to run it and test it. So we have a lot of designers, product designers, designing digital products, perhaps even product managers joining us on this podcast, listening in. A lot of us seem to think we uniformly apply certain principles of behavior science, of psychology, but for those of us keen to actually master this to some extent, what advice would you give us? Where can we get started?
Okay, so you see, all of you, especially the design world, you are already in doing live projects. So you are daily working on problems which may be behavioral in nature. Now, where to get started is it's an interesting question. Of course, I would say that if you are inclined, then there are many online courses that are available, which are short, specific. Ashoka used to run as well. Ashoka X, University of Toronto run. So doing a short course, because see, what you will realize, especially as designers, is a lot of behavior science is not very different from, let's say, if you talk about user-centered design, a lot of the principles are the same. But what behavior science especially focuses a lot more, one step which I think is there in design, but often not given adequate focus, is the research part of it. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I would say is that especially courses which talk about doing research, especially good qualitative research, I think that would be one skill set to develop, especially for designers, that if suppose, like, even if, when we started working and I come to you and I say, look, waste segregation, we want to design like different, we want to move away from the language of dry and wet because we don't think it's intuitive, we want some other language. Now, how do you design that other language? So for that, for the designer to go back and say, okay, let me go and do a good piece of qualitative research and come back with language that I think will work. Today, often what may happen is that you may talk to a few people, you may do a brainstorming session, you may come up with some good ideas. They may be good ideas, by the way, but I think there is some value in going back to the person that you are designing for and doing a thorough, good qualitative research exercise. So I would say one thing, if for designers especially, is to build their skills when it comes to qualitative research, and perhaps in the next project that they are doing, to try and do a quick dipstick. Go and it doesn't have to be very complicated. And I can talk a little bit on what are some of the principles to follow when you're doing good qualitative research. But having said that, integrating that element of research, that would be the place to start, because once you have a strong understanding of who you're designing for, you have a good understanding of the lives that they lead, you have a good understanding of where your design will fit in their lives, you will then start thinking like them. And that's that is all that behavior science anyway is asking us to do: put ourselves in someone else's shoes and make their life simpler. So that's one. Of course, there are many books. I mean, of course, there's the Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, but there are also some which are more very practical. For example, Katie Milkman has a book on how to change, or there's of course the famous book Hooked. So there are many books so there is of course the theoretical books, but then there are a lot of books which are about habit creation, about gamification, about how to bring about personal change, which all will tell you the 10-15 basic tools or principles that exist in behavior science. And then of course it's about using it on a project.
We share some of these links and names in the description, so you could take a look at it. But I think, yes, this is something that's absolutely fundamental. Without an insight on the person you're designing for, the people you're designing for, design would be absolutely baseless. So you cannot discount that. So you're saying that is essentially what we need to get into, and it's not so much about the specific methods or principles that can help, but essentially we need to focus on the research.
Yeah, so I think research is one. And then, of course, in design, I would say that, as I said, I mean, simplification would be my one mantra. I think because when I work, and not for all designers, but we work with a lot of design firms, and often aesthetics is given a lot of importance, of course. Visuals are given a lot of importance. But in the whole design process, the idea of where is my design, even if it's a communication design, or where is it fitting in a person's life? What will get them to actually engage with that, whatever it is that I'm creating? So that bit of it, just how do I seamlessly integrate my design? How do I simplify? How do I, use language which kind of connects with what the user really cares about? These are all, I mean, again, a lot of the behavior science principles are not rocket science. It is more about, the process that you follow. And you keep a few principles in mind. See, if you had to start with using behavior science, I would say the simplest framework to use is the EAST framework, which the BIT had come up with, which is around make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, make it timely. There are many papers that are available which kind of just talk about this model. So using behavior science principles in your design, you can use the EAST framework. You can it's very easy, and that'll actually kind of tell you that you have comprehensively looked at all the behavior science principles. But I think the step before that, which is around research and really understanding what would make something easy in this person's life, what would make it more attractive, what social settings matter to this person, so that what kind of, if I want to make this behavior more social, how can I make it timely? What time in person's life, either from a morning till evening, or in the calendar year, or maybe when some other specific activity is happening, that I should deliver this communication or this particular intervention. So that, the principles are okay, make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, make it timely. But how do you actually make it easier, make it attractive? All is dependent on actually understanding that first bit, so understanding who is this person. And I think
Right.
that's why I am just saying that, one cannot, I think, and again, this research does not have to be some massive exercise, but
Right.
understanding their lives better. I mean, that's, and that's key to coming up with, a design which would actually work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think it really relate to that, because even if I think of, for example, the jobs to be done framework, we're really trying to get down to what is really the fundamental job to be done here in that situation, motivation,
Yeah.
outcome, or whether it is, the NEMAT framework of motivation, ability, trigger. Essentially, all of those are just keywords and buzzwords unless I have genuinely had an insight on that user's behavior, what is holding them back, what's motivating them. So I think, whether we use one framework or the other, what I'm just reflecting on is essentially you have to have a real a deep insight into what makes it tick, what's coming in the way.
And I would add one thing. So, and once so you've done the research, you've done the design, then I think one of the things that we don't end up doing enough is testing.
Right.
We've already now spent so much effort doing the research. Now we've come up with a few designs. We choose design based on, this just looks better or this seems better to us, and we choose a design. I think what we don't do enough of, and in fact, that actually comes in the way of companies applying data science, is because you see, you may design something, but we know that majority of designs won't work. So you have to have a DNA in the organization that, okay, look, I'll come up with 5 or 6 different things. I'll test and I'll see what works.
Yeah.
You have to be open to many things not working. You have to also have a data analytics team, or a team on the ground who can quickly run these pilots, learn from it, improve, and so on and so forth. So often what will happen is that you've already invested so much time designing something, then you just go ahead with it and then
Yeah.
you roll it out, right? And in ideal situation, you should come up with 4 or 5 different designs and then have a way of quickly testing it and then deciding, based on, see, because whatever research you may have done, the best research in the world also can miss, and
Yeah.
you cannot get actually in a person's brain, right? I mean, you can, of course, a lot of the research has to depend on what the person has told you, though there are better ways of asking that, but still you are sort of dependent on what you're hearing, what you're seeing. So research is an important part. The design part, obviously, you've got it covered. Then having the DNA or the ability to say that, okay, we'll come up with 4 or 5 designs and then we'll have a quick way of going and testing it and seeing which is likely to see the most adoption, and you can have metrics on how do you design that experiment. But I think that testing bit is another thing which often does not happen.
Yeah.
I think more and more tech companies do it. So, of course, the example of Booking.com, which is running 2,000 experiments a year, where you are A/B testing. And of course, A/B testing is much easier in a digital environment. If you have to do it on the ground, testing different designs becomes, that much more difficult. But I think figuring out a lean, nimble, fast way of testing quickly, getting feedback, improving, choosing between different designs, I think that is also a key skill that needs to be built. So design sits in the middle, but before design comes the research part, and after design comes the testing part. And I think all of it together, works
Yeah.
brilliantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so here we call it the voice of design, where the role of a designer is to uphold the voice of the customer or the user and the business. So it works only if it is really effective. So you can't just leave it at, delivery of the design, but how is
Yeah.
it faring with the real user? So it would be an expensive mistake. And you're right, we don't do it enough, companies.
And, and
Uh,
and and the worst is that sometimes when we do come up with designs, then we go back to the consumer and we ask them, okay, which one do you like the most? But you see, it's not a popularity
yeah,
contest. Actually, the test that you
yeah,
need to do is which of these is most effective in changing behavior. So that's where because the easy thing would be that, okay, I come up with 5 designs, I go to the target customer, just pick which one do you like. Of course, that is still better than doing nothing. But the real way of testing would be that you have a nimble way of seeing, again, that would it actually be effective in changing behavior. So that's the kind of testing DNA. Again, very easy to do a digital thing, because if you change something, then you can easily know whether that metric that you're trying to affect is changing or not. Becomes slightly more difficult when you're doing it on, let's say, you want to solve anemia and you have 5 different interventions. If you've done that, I mean, you try and then you are actually getting data from the ground, seeing, okay, in terms of the number of pills the woman has taken, do the number of pills vary in this versus that? That's
Yeah.
that's slightly harder. But all I'm saying is that the testing should not just stop at some sort of a popularity contest. Which one do you like the most? The testing should go and ask the question which is likely to be the most scalable, most effective, most impactful.
And I think it is what you said, has to be in the DNA of the company and the organization to allow for that, because that is the process that leads to results. Yeah.
Yes.
And we spoke of how sometimes, asking or direct metric is not always the right way. There's sometimes proxies, even in terms of unlocking insights. Are there any interesting methods that some of us may not be aware of indirect ways or, different ways of getting that?
Okay, so the first thing would be that, as much as you can get away from asking and move to observational research, that's always better. Because when you're observing, you are not only understanding, answer to a specific question, maybe a product or a process that you are interested in, but you are also understanding where that fits in the broader context of their lives and so on and so forth. So whenever you can, apart from asking questions, if you can spend time in that environment, observe and so on and so forth, I think that is obviously, must be one thing that you do over and above just asking questions. But even when you're asking questions, I think there are a few things that one can keep in mind to get better answers, or again closer to the truth than not. So one is that, one when you're asking questions, it should actually focus on behavior and not only on attitudes and beliefs.
Mhm.
So if you want to understand, like let's say you want to understand nutritious diet, it's not enough to ask, what do you think you should give a child, but you need to come and say, okay, what do you give your child? So that's obvious that you focus on. But I think taking it one step forward, what happens in a lot of surveys or even qualitative research we do, we try to get people to rely too much on long-term memory. So we'll ask very general questions like, in the last 6 months, how many times did you do X? I mean, most of us have no idea what we did in the last 6 months. I mean, I've looked at questionnaires where people are being asked, okay, so please tell us, in the last 6 months, how many times did you give your children fruit, for example? Or even in the last 1 month, forget 6 months, even in the last, it's a very difficult question to answer. And frankly, whatever answer is going to come is really not going to be very helpful. Because see, at the end of the day, what is the purpose of research? The purpose of the research is to understand the person, and so that you can come up with some ideas. And I mean, you have for the design phase. So by asking them questions like doesn't, what would be a more powerful question to ask would be not some general question about last X months, but okay, yesterday,
Yeah.
what did you do? What did your child eat?
Yeah.
And by the way, when that woman or that man is actually narrating the story of yesterday, you will also understand a lot about what happens in their life. Okay, the child woke, but oh, I could not do the X because I was in a hurry, and so what I did was Y. And there would be less defensiveness also, because you're just asking them about a day. You're not asking them, when you're asking them about 6 months, then you're kind of who's asking them, are you a good person? Are you a good mother? But if you're asking about yesterday, then you're also kind of taking that away, and and of course you're not relying on long-term memory. Yesterday is something I can remember. And when I
Right.
tell you a story of a day, when I'm telling you a story, you will learn much more about my life than any number or anything that I throw at you. So that's another thing. Get people to tell stories,
The
stories that they.
stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The third thing I would say is that we often end up in these questionnaires, or whenever we're doing surveys, to ask why do you do this, like why do you not do this? Again, we're asking people to give their philosophy. Much
Oh,
better is the other four W's. Okay, so when XYZ happens, when does it typically happen? With whom are you, when you're doing XYZ? Where does it typically happen? What is happening around you when this happens? So you are asking questions more about the context, rather than asking them to give you a rationalized sort of answer saying, why does this happen? Or why does this happen? So instead of focusing on the why, you focus more on the when, with whom, where, what. The fourth thing I would say is that always ask them for counterfactuals. So you tell them, okay, this is what you usually do, but tell me a time when you did the opposite. Because when you ask them for counterfactuals, you understand, situations. Again, you ask them, when was this? When, with whom was it? Where was it? What was it? You may get some good ideas about when the behavior does happen in a remote, or a desired behavior happens, or a not desired behavior does not happen. What is happening around it? The fifth thing I would say is that always look for the positive deviance. So if you have a whole bunch of people who do not, let's say engage in a behavior, find that one person in the same circumstance who has managed to do that. So, when you're looking at pregnant women, you find that one pregnant woman who took her 180 pills in the same setting. You try to understand. So, we're always looking for barriers. We're
Yeah.
always in our research looking for why is this not happening? Why is this not happening? Okay, you go to the person who's not doing it. Why are you not doing this? That's our typical approach to research. But here you go to the person who's actually able to do it, and then from her or his or her life, you understand, okay, what is required, for a behavior to happen. That'll give you way more ideas than, just only focusing on the barriers.
Yeah.
And then, of course, lastly, this is nothing new, is that use of projective techniques. Don't just ask people about themselves, because again, that defensiveness comes in. But you all ask them about what others are doing, what do your friends do, and so on. So, of course, the last bit, I think most researchers actually have understood and do it. But I still find some of the other things that I've mentioned, that is focusing too much on the whys, focusing too much on long-term memory, focusing too much on barriers. That still happens a lot, in research, or focusing only on what, question and answers, and not observing. So these things still remain a huge part of qualitative research, which we need to change.
That was really useful. I think especially the aspect of focusing on the why. I think some of us have been trained to think like that uncover the why. So therefore the interpretation is ask why. What
Exactly.
you're saying is actually throwing light on something completely different. That if you want to
Absolutely.
understand the why, then the context matters.
Yeah, I mean, it could be simple things, like a lot of times, everybody, every human being, thinks of themselves as, and we are thinking individuals. The minute you ask me why, you are actually working on my system 2 part, right? I'm now thinking of a why, which sounds reasonable to me, but also sounds reasonable for me to tell you. A
Yeah.
person who's you coming and asking me, kind of say something about my identity. So whys are very, I would say, sure, you can ask them right at the end, but I would rely much more on, suppose if you ask, this is very interesting. Like you may ask, like, you're doing Swachh Bharat mission, and you ask the girls, why you don't want to use the toilet. They may come up with any reason, but then when you uncover it, so you realize that actually, um, if you try to get them to describe, for example, what happens in the morning and so on, you realize that actually one of the things they value is that they are with their friends when they go out into the fields. They're doing the where they go could be a specific place where they also have time to gather together. So you will learn much more than if you ask her why, because why she'll just give you some answer which sort of sounds reasonable. So definitely understanding with whom, when, where, what. I think those are much more interesting questions to ask.
That's fascinating. I think that's something that's going into my personal workflow of, yes, I care about the why, but is it best to start with actually asking why? So that's
Yes.
it's a very big takeaway for me. And I think it's also something interesting you spoke of, which we practice also, is if we can get somebody to tell a story, there is
Yes.
just so much to learn from that organic way of sharing. And it's definitely not just linear, it uncovers
Absolutely.
the why in a very different way.
Yes.
And I think earlier you spoke of, you're also consulting with a lot of private organizations. I think you're working with Water, Media Network, very few more. So you can tell us more about, what kind of work that involves and how ready are organizations to actually bring this into practice.
See, if you frankly ask me, private sector does more using or uses behavioral science and has been using it way more than the development sector has done. It's just that development sector likes to call it behavior science. That's fine. Frankly, every app that you use is using the
Yeah.
principles of behavior science. I mean, whether it's
Yeah.
showing you where you are in your chart, your cart journey, to all the notifications that you get, streaks in Snapchat,
Yeah.
Zomato making that default choice of no cutlery, Dunzo humanizing the delivery partner for tips. I mean, Uber's incentive systems to keep drivers on the road and so on. So all of these are using behavior science. So private sector, especially in the digital realm, are not only using but using very well to meet business objectives. And what obviously, as I've already mentioned, what makes it easier is that in a digital environment, A/B testing is much easier. You try something, it works, doesn't, you know immediately you can try something else, right? So private sector already, so a lot of the work right now where, behavior science gets used in the private sector is around digital products. And the typical issues would be, how do I engage? How do I retain? How do I get people to buy more? If it's a partner app, how do I get them to stay on the app for longer? So then, of course, now we are, for example, work not just for the private sector companies which are focusing on, the rich or the tier one. Now when you go down a little bit, when you're talking about tier two, tier three rural, then a lot of the work becomes around, this is not necessarily a literate TG. What if a lot of our app design has been keeping in mind a certain level of literacy? I
Yeah.
mean, even the simple thing, one of the things is that we are very used to opening tabs. Why? Because we also do it on computer. We understand one tab, another tab. That's how you go. But when you go down to, when you talk to people in rural India or even semi-urban and so on, they are much more. They are much more open, or they are much more comfortable with scrolling. So now when you're thinking about designing, so a lot of work that I'm now doing, especially with financial inclusion in fintech and so on and so forth, is if we are now going to, because a lot of digitization has happened in the financial sector, right? So we work with players who are doing, digital credit or digital savings or, UPI and so on and so forth. There, a lot of the work is, how do we design a product which actually works and makes it easy for people who may not have come from computer first, who may not come with high level of literacy, and more importantly, come from a place of low confidence. How do we design for them? So a lot of the work on design there is about, ways in which you can increase their own confidence in using that product. And how do you use different features or different aspects of your product to do that? So private sector, but for me, the interesting work in private sector is really happening when we are now designing for people who we have never designed for before. And we are kind of thinking from scratch. By the way, should it even be an app? Because a lot of the products now we want to just give over WhatsApp. Why? Because you already have a behavior which works and so on. So, moving from text to voice, we've been now working on bite-sized influencer style videos which are embedded in financial service apps, because we know that is what, it is very relatable. It very simply answers questions. People are very used to seeing reels to answer their questions, right? So why can't we kind of take that element and put it in this more boring world of finance, right, to make it more accessible? So that's the bit in the private sector which is very interesting for me, designing for a very different audience.
Yeah, and I think now with languages and translation, like you spoke, voice as the new interface opening up, there's a lot of work to do there because all
Yeah,
of the technology that's been somewhere limited to certain audiences, now it's high time it's already starting to open up because of what technology is allowing for language translation. So even at scale, financial and other products which are now starting to open up to a much wider audience.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
I can't reiterate more that, we always believe, and that's also one of our faults, that, when we are designing, we think that, this is just a low literate, low income segment. So we kind of assume that, that the ability to learn would be lower. And so there is again a lot of too much emphasis paid on things like training and education, which I think are all important. But I think, thinking a little back on, it's just that, the product doesn't speak to them. It doesn't work in the way that they are used to. Their issues sometimes are not about literacy. As I said, it's about confidence. It's just that I have, first time you're dealing with the world, and also an impersonal world for the first time, happens with women a lot. I mean, when we do work with them, which is just a little bit of confidence building, you realize that they are more digitally literate, and then they're financially using more as well. So
Yeah.
again, the way to work on it is very different. And so designing for this, the next billion, without thinking that they are, just not as well equipped as us. No, it's just that they come from a sometimes from a slightly different starting point. So how do we meet them, and design for them? And again, of course, I cannot, without proper research, understanding their context, how are they using other apps, what are the apps which have made a headway, how are they using it, what do they find it easy, why are YouTube, is so preferred versus, all other apps. So you take those findings and then you say, okay, I may be designing a financial services product. What can I learn from that?
Yeah, I think this can be a whole chapter on how, as creators or even researchers, how can you put away yourself in terms of your biases and your concepts and ideas when you really want to learn. That
Yeah.
I think that's a very important skill to just unlearn and be
It's
away
hard
to
to do,
listen.
sometimes that's why I say testing is the only thing where your intuition goes
Yeah,
and dies. You learn it the hard way. And it's happened to us
yeah,
many times that when you test it, you're like, how could this not work? I was so sure that this
yeah.
was, when we went to do anemia work, we were sure the testimonials were the answer. We were so gung ho about these amazing testimonials that we created, and it had no impact at all. So sometimes, you can't get rid of your own biases, but that's why you put that last step, which is actual testing to see, where is my bias or my intuition's gone wrong, and they will often go wrong.
Which, yeah, which is why the process is important at
Yes.
center of everything. Yeah. Does it impact, does this understanding of human behavior impact your day-to-day life outside of work? Because I do feel personally for me, sometimes when I learn, conversations like this and tricks and frameworks, I feel that in my personal life, I'm able to navigate better with, for example, my colleagues. I understand why my father doesn't behave the way I want him to, and I feel like I can trick him into it because I understand that a little better. Do you feel that in your life?
Absolutely. In fact, as I started right at the beginning of this podcast, I said that, my interest initially was not about behavior science or using it for corporates. I mean, I've been only interested in why people behave the way they do. So for me, of course, understanding behavior science or using it, just working in this area, 100% it gets you to look at all behaviors, and especially when there are behaviors that you would like to be a little different. For example, as a parent, you would like your child to do X versus Y. I'm tempted, and I often do use a lot of the behavior science tools to do that. But also for my own self, I mean, I know that we all know this concept of commitment device, that commitment devices work, especially when you make a public commitment. So even simple things like if there is any new resolution I made, whether it's a new year or any other resolution, I mean, I would go and talk about it to five of my closest friends. I will make it a point. I won't keep it secret, because I do know that by a social, public commitment that I have made, that is going to play a role in me, being able to achieve it or not. Similarly, even things like visual charts to progress, to map my progress on a goal. I mean, I use that for myself. I use that for my household, and it's again a very powerful tool. If you're saying, okay, daily I want to do this thing, and to be able to cut it on a chart, on a daily basis, that yes, it was done, and you can see it visually. I mean, that again is it's a these are just some simple things that one uses. I mean, if there's any new behavior that I want to start, I would put a reminder or a daily reminder on my phone for a month at least, because after that it'll become a habit. But for that 1 month, I want like a reminder, even if it's the smallest thing. I mean, there are sometimes very, very small things that I want to change, but I will, because I know that I may forget. Forgetfulness is a
Yeah.
huge part, So yeah, there's inertia, but if you have set up the alarm, that alarm will ring and it'll at least remind you of it, and you are more likely to take. So that I'm just giving you small examples, but absolutely, I mean, everything that we learn, and that's why Katie Milkman's book is very interesting, because it is all about how to use behavior science to change in personal life. It's a very interesting book. But yes, absolutely. I mean, I would say that it would be almost a disservice if you learned so much about human behavior and you're trying to change the world and you're not able to implement it in your own life.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick that book up next. So thanks for sharing. But I think just the experimentative nature of this process is just so exciting, and it's very true that that's literally the design process that we follow as well. Thank you so much, Pooja, for sharing these insights. I have personally just taken away so much from this conversation, and I'm going to stay in touch. There's a lot of work we're doing in
Sure.
UPI and some of the financial products that you mentioned. So lots to learn, and we'll stay in touch.
So absolutely, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. In fact, while talking, a lot of new thoughts and ideas came to my mind. So it's always a pleasure to have these conversations.
Super. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pooja.
Thank you so much, Gopal.